Welcome to my presentation about architectured interface in Bimaterial attachment. So as Nicolas said, I'm a PhD student under the supervision of Davide Ruffoni at the University of Liège in his lab, so of mechanics of biological and bio-inspired materials. And we work also in collaboration with Peter Varga from the Research Institute of Davos. So in order to look at bimaterial attachment, first we'll take inspiration from nature. What are the strategies that nature is applying to solve this issue? So there are two strategies basically. There is a long gradient, which is here represented by a byssus, so it's a shell in the sea, where you have the fiber linking the inside of the byssus to the rock. And it is usually of the order of the centimeter length scale. And when you're looking at the mechanical properties of these fibers, it is actually a long gradient in stiffness. Or there are the short gradient, which is represented here by the Achilles tendon. So, as Davide explained you, there is a short transition to link the stiff bone of 20 gigapascal to the soft tendon. And it's actually quite strong and resilient because, as he said, it can handle millions of loading cycles for high load. So we, in this work, will focus on those short gradients to try to reproduce them. And how we will reproduce them is by using 3D printing technology. So I pass a bit fast on this because David just showed it to you this morning. So basically, we use multi-material 3D printing from Stratasys. We have the possibility to print glassy polymer and rubbery polymer. We have small droplet dimension, which allows for good control on the local microstructure, and so the mechanical property of the parts. And here we will work using what we call voxel 3D printing. So basically, I will use reference unit cells called voxels that will be bigger than this minimal droplet dimension. So now that we know how to print it, we have to make those bimaterial attachment. And actually, it is not straightforward to make a bimaterial attachment that will break at the interface. So we looked at what was already done, and actually Lumpe, they did a lot of work with the influence on the printing direction of longitudinal samples. And they looked also at the different stiffness ratio between the soft and the rigid materials that you can use. So you can see here that depending on the orientation of the printing, you have the sample, one layer, I would say, of the sample that is printed in one go of the head and that is cured at the same time. And here you can see that it is divided into multiple head paths, which can have an influence on the mechanical property of the overall product. Also, the stiffness ratio investigated, they range from a ratio of 2 to 1000. And when we look at the result, what we see is that basically for a small stiffness ratio, there is failure all the time at the interface between the stiff and the rigid materials. And when you increase this stiffness ratio, now the printing direction comes into play, because for longitudinal printing along X, you have most of the failure appearing inside the material, usually inside the soft material. But for the printing along Y, all of the failure occurs at the bimaterial attachment, which is what we want. And if you increase too much the stiffness ratio, then it breaks, let's say, evenly if it's printed along X or most of the time in the material failure. So from this, we take on that we print in the direction of Y in order to have a bimaterial attachment that will be a weakness and that will detach, and that our elastic contrast should not be too high. Actually, our elastic contrast will be of 40, and here you can see that it is more or less of 50. So we will stay in those range. Another work that we thought was really interesting is a paper of Uzan, where they basically tried to reduce the concentration of stress at the bimaterial attachment using a small intermediate material. And so, as you can see here, they made one sample with basically the rigid and the soft polymer, and here with the intermediate layer. What you see in terms of the concentration of stress is that when there is no intermediate layer, there is a high concentration of stress at the interface, which is expected, but they manage to spread it, to reduce it evenly on the both sides of the new intermediate layer by introducing material with a specific Young's modulus that follows this small equation. So it's basically the square root of the product of the two Young's modulus of the two materials. And they showed that here, if you increase the number of layers following this rule, then you will have an even distribution and reduction in stress concentration. Now we thought this might be interesting because, of course, we want to improve the performance of the Bimaterial interface. So, regarding all of this, we got our aims for the work, which is to prototype the new Bimaterial attachment based on a minimal perturbation, as I showed you for the bone tendon. We want to understand the impact of the perturbation on the stiffness, the strength, and the failure behavior, because we want to improve the mechanical performance of those attachments. And we want to understand the local stress distribution at those interfaces. So how do we do? As I told you, we take voxel size of 420 micron side. As David explained you, it's because of the blurring that occurs depending on how the two materials are deposited and cured. And here in our sample that you can see here, they will be, the two different materials will be deposited at the same time, so there will be a blurring occurring. And we want it to not influence too much our results, so we work with those voxel size. And the perturbation goes on 4 of those voxels at the interface. So the interface is made of 4 of those voxels, which represents less than 10% of the length, which we said then is minimal perturbation. For the different patterning and geometries that we investigate, we have a flat case, which we serve as a reference one. We have otherwise 6 other configurations that we call ordered interface patterning. And as for the methods, we do some FE simulations staying in the elastic domain to have an idea how the stress is distributed at the Bimaterial attachment. And we also perform some experimental testing by printing the sample and then breaking them in uniaxial tension test. So, regarding the geometries, we have those here. So you can see here the flat geometry case with the 2 different Young's modulus. For the rigid material, we have 2 gigapascal, and for the soft material, we have 50 megapascal. We then have what we call a triangular pattern, a chessboard pattern, a rectangular pattern, an interlocking one, a soft interface, which is actually made of material of a which is softer, than the 2 material constituting the half of the sample, which is a little bit with what Davide showed you, that inside this bone tendon interface, there is this drop in mechanical performance. Let's say the small material is more compliant than the 2 basic ones. And then an interface that we call a stagger one. Why those geometries? Because we wanted to test different interdigitation between the material. As in the bone tendon, it's more or less a combination of all of those. Here we wanted to study each of them separately to understand it. So we'll first start with the simulation and comparing the flat case with the soft interface geometry. So basically in those graphs, you can see the concentration of stress at the interface of the Bimaterial with the stress normalized by the far field stress. So in terms of representation, you have the edge line, which is this one in blue that I put on the side of the sample. There is the middle line, so it's basically the line going through the middle of the sample. And what we call the maximum stress line, which is a line moving in between those two, depending on the geometry, that represents the maximum peak of stress along the Bimaterial attachment. Okay? And what we can see here is, as expected for a finite sample, for the flat case, there is a strong concentration of stress at the interface on the edge of the sample, so it's here. And what we see for the soft interface is the same. So there's a strong concentration of stress at those regions. But what is already interesting to observe is that our concentration of stress is smaller than the flat case, which was a bit unexpected at the beginning. And now when looking at the stress field, we can see that indeed those areas are where the maximum of stress is occurring. And here you have it for the soft interface. Now, regarding the other geometries, those are the same graphs. What we can directly see is that the maximum stress line is not anymore the edge, the line that is on the edge of the sample. So there is a moving or a differentiation between those two, which means that the maximum peak of stress is somewhere inside the material and not anymore on the edge. And also, all of those maximum stress line, they are higher than for the flat one. So there is a higher concentration of stress in those areas. And here I just added the chessboard, and you can see that actually it goes up to a ratio of 14. So it really increases a lot, the concentration of stress. For the three other geometries, we can say the same thing, basically. And you can see that somehow it is possible for some of them to locate this high concentration of stress. For example, here on the triangular, we can see it here. For the interlocking, it's a bit more difficult to notice it. And for the staggered, more or less, we can detect it here. But just to have a correct idea and measure of how much it spread from the edge, we actually measured this distance, between the free edge of the sample and the maximum stress. And you can see that basically it has increased for all the geometry except the flat and the soft interface, as I showed you, which means that we have now really a shifting of the stress inside the material. And we will see, I will show you if it has an influence or not on the results of the experiments. First, before going to the experiments, I wanted to investigate a little bit more the influence of this soft interface at the Bimaterial attachment, because it is the only one that reduces the stress concentration. So I broke a little bit my rule to not to only go for short perturbation, and we increased basically the width of this intermediate layer to see how it behaves. And you see that basically if we increase the width, the stress is actually the concentration of stress is actually increased up to a point where the limit case is half of the sample is of the material of 2 gigapascal and the other half is of the 2 megapascal of the soft interlayer. And then once we saw that it was coherent with our result, we applied, let's say, what I call the mismatch criteria of Uzan. So the one reducing the most the concentration of stress. And we can see that for a wide intermediate layer, it works, which means that we have it's a bit more than a reduction of a factor 2 in the concentration of stress, whereas for other value of Young's modulus, we do not have even, let's say, spreading of the concentration of stress. But interestingly, when going back to the short perturbation, so going back from 32 voxels to 4 voxels, it is not valid anymore. So now we have that this theoretical optimized value is not the optimized one anymore. So there is another effect there that we have to investigate in order to understand how this criteria is changed. And actually, you can see that now the stress that spread more evenly, the concentration of stress, is the Young's modulus of 50 megapascal. So quite interesting. Now going for the experimental result. I will show you one by one here the stress strain curves, and then I will comment a little bit on the picture here that you see of the fractured sample. So in blue here we have the flat case, which is this one. You see a nice clean breaking at the bimaterial attachment. For the triangular, it is here. You see that the crack follows correctly the path that we designed, and we have a significant increase in strength. Then we have the rectangular one, which is located here, where surprisingly it doesn't follow the pattern of the small digitation inside the stiff material. It breaks in one line on the side of the soft material. There you have the chessboard, which basically behave the same, one breaking on one side, not inside the patterning. For the interlocking, which is here, the same. There is no pattern, the crack doesn't follow the pattern inside the material. For the staggered, which is here, the same again happens. No crack propagating inside the pattern. And finally, for the soft interface, we have a breaking inside the soft on one side and through the soft material, and then on the other side, which has a significantly smaller stiffness and strength. From those graphs, we extract some mechanical properties to see how the improve or not improving mechanical properties occurred. So we computed the apparent stiffness and the strength of those different geometries. So you can see that for the apparent stiffness, except for the rectangular, which is a little bit higher, and the soft interface, which is smaller, it is more or less on the same level as for the flat case. So, yeah, sorry, in black here you have the reference case, and in green is what I call the order pattern. And now here for the strength, there you see that there is a significant increase in the strength for most of the ordered pattern except the interlocking and the soft one. So interestingly, by just making a small patterning at the interface, we increase the strength, whereas the apparent stiffness, we can say that except for the soft interface, it's more or less the same. We also looked at the what we call the pre-failure work and the post-failure work, which is represented on this small graph here. So the pre-failure work is the work required to plastically deform the material up to the strength. And then the post-failure is the energy needed to completely break and propagate the crack through the sample. And here the difference is even higher than before. We have that the pre-failure work has increased drastically compared to the flat one in 4 of the different configuration, not in the soft interface and the interlocking, because as you saw on the graph, they perform less. Less than the flat case. And it is identical for the post-failure work, with a strong emphasis on the triangular pattern, which is present the highest performance in both cases. And in terms of ratio, we can have this increase in work. So that is it for the presentation. On small conclusion on the really 2 sides that I presented, we saw that by adding this small intermediate layer of softer Young's modulus, we have a decrease in stress concentration and mismatch between the 2 materials. So this is promising in improving the fatigue performance of the material, because as Davide explained, it is used for many loading cycles in natural material, but it needs to be investigated more. And we also saw that with minimal perturbation at the attachment, we are able to increase the strength and the failure resistance of the material. And we also induce a shift in the maximum stress inside those materials that leads basically to better mechanical performance in uniaxial tension. And that's it for me.